So thank you all very much for coming. I'm very excited about today. Every year, I'm Mark Massa. I'm the Dean of the STM, and when I came to Boston College, I started something called the Dean's Colloquium on Religion and Public Culture, and we've done a number of them, and this one is I'm especially interested and excited about. Usually the Dean's Colloquia are full of intellectual firepower, and today will be one especially full of intellectual firepower. So thank you. Before we start, I just want to do some thank yous. Many folks made today happen, and I want to publicly thank, in your name, Terry Lima, Maura Kaliri, Kristen Patterson, Melinda Townsend, and Jane Regan. So why don't we give them a round of applause, please? Today was a brainchild that started last June in Washington, D.C., in the headquarters of Bread for the World. It was the brainchild of a bunch of very smart people where there was a previous conference on libertarianism. And it was over lunch, and I was talking to Michael Sean Winters and Steve Schneck. And when I came back here, I talked to Alan Wolf and Cathleen Kaveny. And the four of them kind of like, it's our conversations, as often happens in these kind of events. It's the result of conversations that develop over time. So I want to publicly acknowledge the four of you and thank you for sort of putting the idea in my head about today. And that you were the folks who sort of came up with the names for the various panelists. So thank you. I have the distinct honor of introducing our first speaker this morning. Alan Ryan has a very long list of impressive academic titles and honors that he has accrued. He has been warden of New College, Oxford, which I think is the college actually with the most beautiful chapel at Oxford. He's the director of the Rothermere American Institute. He's been lecturer in moral philosophy and politics, and a great title, A Reader in Politics ad Hominem. I want to find out what that is. Actually, I've never seen anything quite like that. Not least of the impressive list of honors is the fact that he was elected as a fellow of the British Academy in 1986, which is a very big deal indeed. He is currently professor of politics at Princeton University, and this year he is the William H. Bonsall Visiting Professor at Stanford University. Professor Ryan's scholarship has set the benchmark for lucid and insightful commentary on thinkers from Aristotle, Machiavelli, and Alexis de Tocqueville to John Stuart Mill, John Dewey, and Bertrand Russell, on all of whom he has written very interesting and important books. Professor Ryan's 1998 book entitled Liberal Anxieties and Liberal Education set off interesting conversations and debates everywhere, including here at Boston College. His 2012 book entitled On Politics was hailed on both sides of the Atlantic as a landmark study and now provides a clear and engaging starting point for informed political debate on political philosophy. His recent collection of essays entitled The Making of Modern Liberalism was named by Choice magazine as one of the outstanding books of 2013. Ladies and gentlemen, it does me great honor in Boston College to introduce to you Professor Alan Ryan.
It's very nice to be praised in this fashion, and I'm very grateful to Mark Massa for inviting me, but I have to start with a confession, which is that the line I am about to take simply contradicts the title of the colloquium. Since what I'm about to say is that libertarianism is a form of liberalism, and it's a form that gets rather close to anarchism, and indeed I think a coherent form of libertarianism is a form of anarchism. But apart from starting apologetically, what I'm going to do, just to sketch the outline and then I'll get on with it, I don't have anything to say about the bearing of libertarianism on Catholicism, partly because I know very little about current debates inside the Catholic Church, and although I have been gazing in a slightly appalled way at things like the Indiana restoration of religious freedom legislation and so on, I have no really strong views on it because, roughly speaking, being appalled is about as far as I get. I mention only in passing the importance of religion in the work of one of the founding fathers of the libertarian tradition, according to libertarians themselves, namely John Locke. But I do it for a purpose, and that is that if you try to build your politics entirely on a theory about what rights individuals have, you are likely to find yourself very short of a theory of the good, a theory of what people ought to do with the rights they have, and so on down the line. Point made by that liberal L.T. Hobhouse a very long time ago, and a point deliberately ignored by John Rawls some 40 years ago. So even these glancing remarks about the importance of a religious background in the work of someone like Locke has a certain amount of contemporary resonance, but I don't really pull it out. What I'm about to do is very arm's length. That's I don't get into fights particularly. I do have strong views about large numbers of issues, but nobody needs to know them, though I'm prepared to defend them if anybody wants them. The one thing I ought to say by way of warning to an American audience is that I shall sometimes sound rather disobliging. And I will sound as though I have been ingesting Louis Hartz's liberal tradition in America too uncritically, because I will often sound as though I'm saying that Americans mislabel both liberalism and conservatism, as though I'm claiming, so to speak, copyright for the English or European understanding of those terms. The answer is I'm not. That I would sound disobliging to an English audience because I would insist on reminding them that what Americans called liberalism and conservatism was very different from what they called liberalism and conservatism. But it's merely that I wish to make absolutely clear that this kind of transatlantic malentendu, or the old joke about two peoples separated by a common language, that the common terminology disguises enormous differences, and one really has to remember it. The other morning, David Boas, who runs the Cato Institute and has recently written a book on the libertarian mind, was talking about his views on NPR and said that, among other people, one of the founders of libertarianism was John Stuart Mill. This is totally and absolutely, comprehensively and conclusively false. Among the things to which Mill was deeply committed was the view that property rights could be tinkered with by a rational liberal society to any length that seemed good in the light of their values, and the notion that individuals could stand pat on ownership rights was one that Mill never gave house room to. So occasionally, but strictly on historical grounds, I stamp my little feet, but that's about as far as it goes. So this is, oh, and I'm going to try to shut up after 45 minutes, no longer, in fact less than 45 minutes, in order that people can get their retaliation in without having to wait. This is a philosopher's piece, or a political theorist's take on the topic. I am myself a political junkie. Let's say, unless I get my morning fix of the news, I twitch for the rest of the day. I have strong views about contemporary politics. mostly rather appalled. But I take my brief here to be analysis and a bit of intellectual history rather than a diatribe against the Koch brothers, who are, after all, the financiers of the Libertarian Party in the past and who keep the Cato Institute going in the present. It's an interesting fact about libertarianism is that libertarian intellectuals have always been the pensioners of rich men. Spencer and Carnegie starts a long and honourable, well, a long tradition. How well would these people stand on their own feet in a good libertarian fashion if they had to go and earn their living? Well, never mind. I will end with a very few remarks on my own behalf about the difficulty of giving a rational analysis of property rights that makes them serious enough but not entrenched in a theory of natural rights, and a little bit about the awkwardness of anything you could really call libertarian politics. And I'll just explain why at the end. I think the analysis of property rights is the crucial point in the whole exercise, for reasons I will get to in due course. So I begin with a very simple typology. This is one that everybody, I think, knows off by heart. Then I get on to the underpinnings of the views represented in the typology, then say a bit about the concept of property, which is crucial to the whole exercise. I skirt round the relationship between libertarianism and contemporary conservatism for reasons of a slightly Louis Hartsian kind, and you'll see why in a moment. When David Boaz runs up the flag for the proposition that libertarianism is economically conservative and socially liberal, I think that's not exactly right, but it is certainly what people think it is. And it's quite important to see that that's a sort of political slogan, not really a piece of intellectual argument. You can be economically conservative and socially liberal, but libertarianism isn't in principle because it is much too enthusiastic for what Schumpeter called gales of creative destruction to really be economically conservative. A proper economic conservative would set a very high value on stability. You could, I think, believe in feudalism and same-sex marriage, but it would be a stretch. I mean, who knows what went on in 14th century southern France, but anyway. My doctrine, and this is why I say I'm being disobliging to Dean Massa and the program title, my view is that libertarianism, properly speaking, is ultra-liberal, both ends. And one just has to grip one's teeth. The typology is this. Whether you think there should be more or less, ranging from complete to none, social and political regulation of the economy on the one hand and our sexual, cultural, intellectual, religious lives on the other. This is the question, really, how much authority does society and its representative, the state, have in the marketplace on the one side and in the library and the bedroom on the other? Standard question. Plato's Republic, of course, says complete to both. Stalin's Russia tries to put it into practice without the benefit of Plato, but nonetheless, the notion of complete control in all spheres of life is that. None on both fronts would be Emma Goldman's anarchism, which nobody has ever tried to put into practice, as she discovered when she was deported to the Soviet Union, got disgusted and left. So, typologies. real conservatism. When I say real conservatism, this is Louis Hart's. The old-fashioned European kind says as much as necessary both sides of the question. This leaves large but not unanswered questions about necessary to achieve what, and about what instruments of discipline and coercion we have in mind. That's to say, no conservative thinks that we should have police stationed at the bedroom door, but they do certainly believe in a good deal of social pressure to get people to adopt one preferred picture of their social, sexual, cultural, literary existences. American self-described conservatism is, on this view, a coalition of disparate commitments, which I think is right. Today says no to the first, i.e. as little regulation as possible in the economy, a lot in the second, i.e. a lot of social, if necessary, legal, other forms of regulation in sexual, social, cultural existence. There's much to be said about the awkwardness of being a conservative in America, because American conservatives wish to conserve what is an essentially liberal political, social, legal establishment. I mean, in effect, an American conservative is an 1890s liberal. This is not true of European conservatives who are nostalgic for the world before the French Revolution and the English Reform Bill of 1832. There are real differences. I'm not going to say much about conservatives until the very, very end, and then only a couple of sentences. Liberalism, and here again, same point. Here I mean what is called liberalism in the United States, and this is the worldview of John Rawls and a theory of justice, not the worldview of John Stuart Mill. That picture answers the two questions with as much as is necessary by way of regulation in the market and the economy, but puts a near absolute barrier to coercive interference in matters of conscience and lifestyle. In effect, it lets the state into the market, but puts up very high barriers to the intervention of the state in the library and the bedroom. I note now that it is important not to think that markets could actually function in the absence of a state. Libertarians are deeply committed to thinking they can, but at anything other than the level of barter in a village, they can't. I mean, the notion that a contract for the supply of wireless services from Verizon could operate without an enormous legal, political apparatus to prop it all up is, I think, pure fantasy. And one just has to watch not to get taken in by the analogy of the village marketplace to the workings of a modern economy. So I want to put a set of scare quotes around the notion of intervening, because to my eye, the modern economy, the modern market, is actually a creature of the modern political system. But intervening will have to do for the moment, because that's what everybody else says, and one can't change people's verbal habits instantaneously. The pure version of the no intervention is somebody like Murray Rothbard, who, of course, deeply, deeply detested the whole idea of the state and spent much of his life elaborating a story about anarcho-capitalism, which did suppose that one could manage without a state. But there's a lot of quasi-state apparatus gets produced in the process. roughly speaking, hiring the mafia to help you. And so getting rid of the state, even if you're an anarcho-capitalist, may actually turn out to be a much harder operation than you might think. Libertarianism. In this context, I mean the views of people like Nozick, Rothbard, and a few others. But I don't entirely mean Hayek, who nonetheless is one of their patron saints. Hayek, I think, is a 19th century liberal, and it is rather different. The pure libertarian doctrine says no interference in either realm. Whatever anyone chooses to do with their lives and their stuff. Stuff is David Boaz's typically elegant shorthand for anything you have property rights in, viz. Yourself, external objects, anything of value. They can only be regulated to prevent them interfering with the freedom of others to do what they choose with their lives and their stuff. Polemically, self-described libertarians invoke Hayek continuously, but Hayek, I think, was much too keen on the notion that you needed a lot of cultural pressure in order that you would have a citizenry who could actually function in the kind of 19th century classical liberal context that he has in mind. So I think one has to look out for some sort of story about how you actually get the participants in a libertarian economic structure in order to see how far down the libertarianism goes. Hayek is not a natural ally of 1960s do your own thing, whereas Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State and Utopia really is very much a product of precisely that. So, what do I want to try to persuade you of? Liberalism in 21st century America, that's say what that great intellectual George Herbert Walker Bush called the L word and accused them of going on about the vision thing. Did you ever hear the story of the time he wanted a quotation from Thucydides? Young man was one of his speechwriters and had this line about Thucydides and the Melian dialogue and was going to take Bush through it. Time runs out. Bush just seizes, reads this, gets to the point at which Thucydides appears. As the Greek historian as a Greek historian said, young man thinks, there goes my job. Bush finishes, comes back and says, hey, got any more quotes from that Greek? Never too late to get an education. American liberalism is a very diluted form of what could plausibly be called non-Marxian social democracy. It's the new liberalism of the turn of the 19th, 20th centuries. It's the liberalism of Herbert Croly and John Dewey. It has English counterparts in people like T.H. Green and L.T. Hobhouse. And it is explicitly opposed by the people who produced this in the teens and 20s of the last century to the old liberalism of the 19th century. The old liberalism of the 19th century was what Herbert Hoover espoused, and it's what Hoover described as rugged individualism, deeply laissez-faire. Hoover got very, very grumpy about being described as a conservative, and not until 1945 did he finally give in and agree that it was too late to persuade people to realize that what he really was a liberal. Hayek actually did much the same thing. I mean, Hayek used to lose his temper with people who thought he was a conservative, said firmly he was just a liberal. Old-fashioned laissez-faire individualism is precisely what new liberalism doesn't subscribe to. It, of course, is interventionist, economically non-interventionist, socially. So obviously the large question is, what are the underpinnings of the vision of legitimate authority and so on that sustains these pictures? Dogmatically, for those of you who've been dragged through elementary political theory, I do apologize. This really is, as it were, week one of Paul Thut 101. But it's a way of getting a grip, and given that public discussion tends to be a jumble on this kind of thing, it's not a bad idea to do some very simple carving up. So dogmatically, we can divide the underpinnings into rights-based, consequentialist, and personality-based. One thing to see is that all these take rights seriously. I mean, since political debate is full of people accusing the other side of trampling on people's rights, not taking them seriously, first thing to see is that everybody takes rights seriously. What they have, of course, is very different views about what rights we've got, very different views about what rights rest on, and very different views about how absolute these rights are. And that's where the beginnings of wisdom really come in, because one takes it to bits. You might say that they all take personality seriously, in the sense that the kind of consequences anybody argues about these days are about consequences for individuals, and they are about what kind of lives people can lead and what kind of people they can plausibly be expected to turn into. But of course, the apparatus is going to be different. So when I say they will take rights seriously, what I mean is that a rock-ribbed utilitarian like Jeremy Bentham, who said memorably that natural rights were nonsense, and that natural and imprescriptible rights, rhetorical nonsense, elevated nonsense, nonsense going on stilts. Bentham nonetheless thought that the whole point of government was, so to speak, to lay down what rights people had, to enforce them, which was the process he called as rearing the fabric of felicity, i.e., getting the rights right in order to achieve maximum welfare of the whole population. No natural rights, conventional rights, rights created by political, legal activity, having rights absolutely essential to prosperity, to security, to human happiness, but not the gifts of nature. So a quick sketch, which is a bit parodic, but there we are, goes like this. Some modern theories of liberalism, and I think Rawls's in particular, try to work with the thinnest possible conception of human nature, because they take the priority of the right, i.e. rules about justice, rules about the enforcement of rights, over the good, i.e. the achieving of a good life, absolutely seriously. I think it's impossible, this is me as opposed to received doctrine, I think it's impossible not to make quite a lot of assumptions about human nature when developing a theory of rights. And I offer you as an instance the way in which Rawls has to plug into human nature a very high degree of risk aversion in order to show to his own satisfaction, though nobody else's, that we would not, in the so-called veil of, behind the so-called veil of ignorance, sign up for a system that permitted slavery. The reason being, we would think the downside risk of being a slave just too great to justify whatever the pleasures might be of being a slave owner. I think that once you let in any story about human nature, you might just as well go the whole hog, reveal your assumptions, and say a lot about human nature. But Rawls certainly doesn't. Consequentialist views make rights part of an indirect strategy to maximize the good. And the question is, what's the good and what rights are we up to? There's a substantial literature generated mostly by Bernard Williams attacking what is known in the trade as government house utilitarianism. Government house utilitarianism presents the picture of intellectuals as if they are the colonial authority. The ordinary uneducated citizenry, the mass, the mob, as being reasonably gullible. So we, the intellectuals, understand that rights are simply a device to achieve the good. They, the mass, think rights are really, really, really rights, that they go all the way down, they're rooted in nature, that they're deep. That rights are, as Ronnie Dworkin called them, trumps. Stand on your rights, and you're standing on something absolutely stable. I have doubts about the extent to which anybody really is a government house utilitarian, which is to say someone who is happy with the idea that the citizens at large should believe what is false about the standing of rights, and the intellectuals and their government lackeys should believe what is true. I think actually the citizens at large are perfectly capable of taking a view about rights that makes them near but not absolute, i.e., that to call something a right is to say that you need more than a narrow calculation of benefit to tinker with it, but not that an individual can stand on the rights to the obvious and great detriment of the rest of society. So I'm not as bothered by government house utilitarianism as all that. What a lot of people are, and this is something which is worth watching, what they are is, and moreover, consequentialists. An indirect theorist of rights says the real argument is utilitarian, rights are a useful device. The and moreover consequentialist says there really, really are rights, quasi-natural rights, somehow built into the universe, and moreover, if you acknowledge them, then things go well. This is David Boaz explaining that the poorest person in America now does better than the Vanderbilts. This apparently is because the Vanderbilts did not have running water in the first houses they built, whereas poor people in America have access to running water. I think that was the worst argument he produced in 35 minutes. Anyway, it's not entirely persuasive. What you find, I think, is, of course, that many, many people on the libertarian side really run a negative line about rights, which is to say that unless you treat them as deep, there is no stopping place before the road to serfdom. Recent book by an old student of mine, John Tomasi, called Free Market Fairness, that essentially works on the Hayekian theory, which is not so much that there are deep property rights, but rather if you bolt them in the right way, then you get the right kind of social outcome. It becomes something closer to a utilitarian argument, but it hovers on the edge of saying, yes, they are natural rights, and they have good consequences, and saying, and anyway, even if they aren't natural rights, treating them as if they are has good consequences. It's all over the literature, and unsurprisingly, because it's not a bad argument. There's a very large question about what consequences liberals want. I am myself heretical on this, because my view is that the consequence liberals want is to produce a society in which as many people as possible are conscientiously signed up for some version of the liberal creed circa John Stuart Mill. I mean, I have fairly unflinching views about this. This is at odds partly with the view known in the trade as a result of John Rawls as political liberalism, which says that what liberalism is essentially a story about how people with very, very different views can live together in harmony and mutual respect. I think the answer to that question is, if you want that, you've actually got to try to persuade people to sign up for a liberal vision of the world. In that respect, I'm on the side of people like Martha Nussbaum, who want to fill out the Rawlsian story. The pure Rawlsian story says people can believe just exactly what they like, so long as they respect this limited range of political prohibitions and guarantees. And I think that's an unstable outcome, because unless people have some really fierce commitments behind their acceptance, I think it doesn't stick. So what sorts of rights theories are there, and so on? The interesting thing about libertarianism, on my view, and I think this is true of Nozick, true of Rothbard, is that they make rights property rights, that all rights are essentially forms of property, that the right to individual liberty is a right of self-ownership, that we are ours. So if you ask yourself questions like, where does the prohibition on interfering with people's sexual, cultural, whatever choices come from? The answer is, it's my body, and I can allow anybody to do whatever I choose with it. This is pure Nozick. There can be no such thing as victimless crimes. There can, of course, be things that people come to regret afterwards. Somebody says to me, I'd rather like your left hand. I think, oh, well, that's right, I'm right-handed. So I cut it off and hand it over. Have they acquired a property right in my hand? On the pure doctrine, yes. It was mine. I have performed a valid transfer, and so on and so on. Suppose I change my mind. Answer, bad luck. You're like the person who sells a field in Pennsylvania to John D. Rockefeller, and Standard Oil comes next, and you think, I shouldn't have done that. Well, bad luck. It was your field, it's now his field. It was your oil, it's now his oil. The pure doctrine says we own ourselves freehold, and so on down the line. Why can't you interfere? You can't interfere because it's crossing the boundary into somebody else's property. Assault is a form of trespass. And once you see that, you see both what the power of it is and what, in some ways, the unpersuasiveness is. Liberal views are sometimes quite like that, in the sense that quite a lot of liberals are tempted by self-ownership, but more often liberals tend to think in terms of the particular kinds of misery and particular kinds of frustration of people's lives that interference in particular areas produces. The sacred text for people like that is Herbert Hart's lectures of 50 years ago now on law, liberty, and morality. Why don't you let the state into the bedroom? The answer is because people's sexual, emotional preferences are so central to their personalities that if you interfere with those, you do a lot of damage which needs a lot of justification. Curious enough, you find that in Bentham. Personality is an awkward term, and because I am overrunning my self-allotted time, I'm going to skip it a bit, but the two notions, I think, are autonomy on the one hand, which of course for libertarians tends to fall back into self-ownership, and the notion of self-development on the other, i.e. making the most and the best of yourself, which is sort of J.S. Mill on liberty, the kind of thing that Dworkin talked about in Justice for Hedgehogs. It's not absolutely lined up with the views of people like T.H. Green, Hobhouse, and Dewey, because they were, so to speak, more socialized in their view of what individual development was like, were more attached to a notion of the common good, and therefore would have associated self-development less with an individual project than with the project of being a fully paid up member of a successful liberal society. I mean, this is one of the many ways in which Dick Rorty was not really much of a disciple of Dewey. So, since, on my view, property rights is what underpins the libertarian picture, 5 minutes on that, a couple of minutes on politics, then I will shut up and you can tell me where I'm wrong. The distinctive thought behind libertarians is that all rights are proprietary, property is sacred. This means that taxation for things like the welfare state is literally theft. Why? Because it's taking what is mine for purposes I have not probably signed up for. It means also that I am being made into a slave. I'm having to do forced labor. Why am I doing forced labor? Because in order to have what I would otherwise have had, for my pile of stuff to be what it would otherwise have been, I have to work longer than I would have chosen. And that, for Nozick following Rothbard, is forced labor. My view, for what it's worth, is that this is rhetorical nonsense. Real forced labor is real slavery. It's peasants doing the corvée, and it's what the French Revolution set out to abolish and did abolish. It is, of course, true that taxation is forced taking. That is true. If I don't pay, I can go to jail. The question really is, how coercive is it? And is it taking what is really mine all the way through and all the way deep down? To which my reply is no. To think it is to have a particular naive view about property rights. Following people like Nagel and Murphy, though I've thought it for 40 years, is that what property rights actually are, for the most part, is a convenient way of organizing production, distribution, cooperation for economic purposes, so that if you ask the question, what is really, really, really mine, the answer is what's left over after you have paid your fair share of keeping the show on the road, which allows you to go to work and earn a living in the first place. This, you will not wish to know, is Marx's picture of bourgeois justice. It is what he talks about in as being the first stage of socialism in the critique of the Gotha program, but the basic notion is that your claims on the social product rest on a theory of justice you have to enunciate is not to be understood best in terms of natural property rights. The person who, in many ways, does a good job on this, curiously enough, is John Locke, who libertarians revere as producing what they think of as absolute property rights, and on my view, does nothing of the sort. And the reason why Locke does nothing of the sort is that in Locke, as in conservatism generally, duties come before rights. The right to acquire property in Locke is the right to do what fulfills an antecedent duty imposed upon you by the God who puts you on the earth, as Locke says, made to go about his purposes. What are his purposes? His purposes are that humanity should flourish as much as may be, and the route to do this is to ensure that you flourish as much as may be, and to do this you've got to make the best of the bounty God gives you. It's the duty to do stuff with the world that founds property rights. They do not come from a freehold in the individual. And you can see this from things like Locke's treatment of suicide and a whole lot else. Richard Epstein, who libertarians think is the great lawyer on their side, began by thinking that Locke was the person who really held the whole thing together, was beaten about the head by Jeremy Waldron, decided that Locke was not the person who held the whole thing together, that natural rights wouldn't do the trick, but then, of course, just has to fall back into the Hayekian position, which is conventional rights treated as if they are natural rights. But if that's the move, then you're vulnerable to people saying, well, you can tinker with conventional rights as far as is useful. So my 30 seconds of off-the-cuff political comment is very straightforward. If you read libertarians, most of what it is an attack on big government combined with some disobliging commentary on the feckless underclass and occasionally disobliging commentary on the religious right. I'll explain why they do that in 10 seconds. Nobody who supports, roughly speaking, welfare state liberalism thinks inefficiency is a good thing. The inefficiency of American government is glaring and obvious, and if you have a nasty political nature, as I have, one of the many things you're likely to say is that part of the inefficiency is that the appalling Constitution gives the rich and the well-situated the ability to take off large and undeserved rewards for their acquiescence in legislation, and that these persons are on the whole supported by the libertarians. So when one hears complaints about big government from the libertarians, a certain amount of proper response is your fault, not mine. The Constitution, I don't think one can blame on contemporary libertarians, though one can blame their enthusiasm for the Supreme Court, which seems to me to be emulating the worst behaviour of its predecessor of the late 19th century, but that's another business. So what do I think, finally, is the two great pieces of libertarian schizophrenia? These are of no use to you for libertarianism and Catholicism, but they are, I think, quite interesting. The first schizophrenia is that libertarians can't make up their mind whether they are a saving remnant. The world is full of all these ghastly people, but we have seen through it. Whether the saving remnant and what is over there is the mass, the mob, the majority. This is Rothbard. It's Rothbard and it's Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand and the libertarians hated each other. It's very good. They hate her because she was a raging militant atheist, which they think one shouldn't be. She disliked them because they weren't raging militant atheists, and because they didn't have her sort of elitist, the lonely individual on the mountaintop versus the mass. But basically, there's a strong streak of that in libertarianism, which, of course, becomes a saving remnant doctrine. The other version, which is where they would actually like to have more influence, is that the libertarians are a natural third party. And they're a natural third party because they appeal to that vast spectrum of the American public who are against big government and who are against the religious right. They don't want to be Republicans because they think the religious right has captured the Republican Party, and they don't want to be Democrats because they think the Democrats are the party of big government, and therefore, what is there left to be? And the answer is all kinds of things, but never mind. What do they think there is left to be? And the answer is libertarians. And that really is the propaganda line that you get out of the Cato Institute, you get from people like David Boas and so on. What do I think about that? I think it's not intellectually interesting. What is intellectually interesting? What's intellectually interesting is really philosophical anarchism, i.e. could you get a state out of where they start from, which is the Nozikian question, and I think the answer is no. I think you'd have to end up with Lysander Spooner, who says that only those who really consent in their own persons at the time are really bound by the authority of government. That actually is my view. I do not believe in the concept of legitimacy in any case, but I think if you start with them, you end up with Lysander Spooner, which is fine by me. That's not the way I do it. The other interesting piece, of course, is market failure. If what you obsess about is individual property rights, what do you do about climate change? Oh, well, you establish property rights. Right, you say. Pollution in San Francisco comes in quite large part from China. Would you just explain what property rights of the inhabitants of San Francisco you plausibly imagine might be enforced against somebody who? In China. Chinese industry generally? Do I get an injunction against them trespassing in my air? How do you do that? So I think interesting stuff on things like market failure really is intellectually interesting. Where markets are and aren't useful, where belief in them gets you into trouble, that I think is really, really, really interesting stuff. The rest, as I say, I think if you like politics, then you don't mind joining in the brawling. If you don't like politics, you don't like joining in the brawling. I mean, my wife keeps on saying, if she hears me say once more, it's time somebody went and scragged whoever it is I have in mind, she will throw the morning coffee at me. I have no idea how it bites on Catholicism. I do know that although I am myself an atheist, I am a devout atheist who subscribes to the view which is absolutely common among persons like myself in England, but comes as a shock to Americans. And the atheist creed is very straightforward. It says, there is no God, and he speaks to us through the King James Bible. I think if you have that view of the world, you actually see further into the intellectual antecedents. Not than Anglicans and Catholics do, but you see further into the antecedents than secular, presentist, on the whole, fairly uneducated, self-professed libertarians tend to. But that's as far as I can get on libertarianism and religion. Now I will shut up and you can have a go.
Ask them to wait for the mic. Alan said he welcomes questions. If you have a question, raise your hand. And please wait for the mic to be delivered. Who is the mic?
Test. Yeah. Professor Ryan, you gave us an extraordinary tour d'horizon, so almost any question we ask you is going to be horribly narrow. With that confession up front, let me ask a very narrow question. Your suggestion, implicit but inescapable, is that the real make or break in political discourse today in America is how the citizenry themselves understand natural rights. The libertarians are hopelessly divided among themselves on the issue of rights and property and how far back they trace it, Mill, Locke, etc. So it's not the libertarians, it's the citizens. Could you give us a bit more on where you see the discourse going in America on rights per se? Thank you.
If that's a narrow question, I hope nobody asks me a broad one. I mean, I have a view which, I mean, I always hesitate to utter it, being a foreigner whose daughter is an American citizen and has been for 20 years, etc., etc. I think none of this stuff actually really bites on what I think is the crucial issue in American politics. And I think the crucial issue simply is race. I think it has been race, I think it remains race, and I think that the answer to your question, so to speak, goes the long way round, which is that people tend to, as it were, push the question about, the depth of their ownership or the extent to which it's decent to stand firm on it's mine, and you can't have it. I think that goes round because I think if you think that the welfare state is a device for transferring money from productive white middle-class persons to a feckless black underclass, then no matter what underlying theory you have about the foundation of property rights, you can fall back on the proposition that hard-working, disciplined people ought not to have to prop up undisciplined, idle, feckless, and self-destructive people. If that's what you think, which is itself not a... I mean, suppose you have that as a picture and you think of yourself in an army battalion, of whom 90% are disciplined, courageous, etc., etc. Property rights nowhere in the landscape. 10% are feckless, can't tell one end of the rifle from the other, likely to drop it on your foot, etc. The 90% are quite likely to think they should not have to hazard their lives to save this disorganized, feckless, mindless bunch. So a theory about, am I my brother's keeper, to which the answer is only to the extent that my brother pays some attention to keeping himself, thank you. If you have that running, then of course it's likely to reinforce the idea that what I have produced, earned, worked for, etc., really is mine. If that's what you think, then of course a doctrine of natural rights is going to start appealing to you, and you'll begin to think that what big government is just a device for stealing what's mine and giving it to them who have no claim on it. But I think the appeal, curiously enough, runs round what still seems to me, the great deformity in American politics. And even people don't talk about it, which is one problem. But there's a certain tendency for people just not to want to have it out in the open. But if you believe, as I do believe, that it underlies a lot of what is out in the open, then of course my story goes, the American citizenry is prone to believe natural rights, partly because of the Constitution. I mean, you hear it in school. You pledge allegiance, you read the Declaration, and, you know, only when you're 12 are you allowed to realize that the Declaration is issued by a bunch of slave owners, etc., etc. If that happens, then of course you think, well, we are committed to natural rights. It's in the Declaration. Since 80% of the population believes that the Declaration is actually in the Constitution. They think natural rights are in the Constitution. 50% believe that to each according to their needs and from each according to their ability is also in the Constitution. The American population's grip on the Constitution is pretty good. But if you think that, then of course what you're likely to think, and what I tend to think, is if you really want to do something about it, you actually have to start by curing the underlying problem. Then people will start shifting their views about rights. And partial evidence of this, curiously enough, really is the Great Depression, because in the Great Depression, black America is just left out of it. And so it's always going to be, as it were, how much grip on what we formerly thought of as privately owned industry, etc., would you allow the government in this kind of situation? And the reply is, as much as needed. Does Andrew Mellon not have a natural right to US steel? The answer is, don't be absurd. But that's because the context has shifted. As the context shifts, people shift their views about rights. So that's a long answer, but I think that's probably the way it runs.
Good morning. Professor Ryan, if you were hired as Rand Paul's political advisor, how would you help him crystallize his views and broaden his appeal for the next election?
Curiously enough, my colleague Stephen Macedo worked for his father in Texas, and a memento of that is a wonderful cartoon from the New Yorker that Steve kept on his office door, which is a couple standing in front of a house, flames leaping through the roof, fire truck outside, firemen in their helmets ready to do battle with the flames. Go away, we're libertarians. I mean, there's nothing I could do with him, for him, because I would have to say, well, you know, throw away all that stuff, and that stuff is really very central to his appeal. I mean, clearly, he and I are going to be on the same page on things like decriminalization of cannabis and the like. And has he come out on same-sex marriage? I mean, Stephen Macedo is actually married. So some members of the tribe have come out in favor in the most literal way. I mean, the bits he could actually do something with, I think, is drastic decentralization, which really does go down the libertarian track, because whatever else they think, small entities are likely to have much more popular support behind them. So decentralization, no foreign wars, no war on drugs, keep the state out of libraries, etc. And I think probably, if you're him, defuse the whole business about things like same-sex marriage, by saying that marriage is simply a civil contract which allows people certain benefits, and if you want it blessed, then go and talk to whichever spiritual entity you're attached to and ask them if they'll bless it. So you split, things that are said to be tightly voluntary, personal, etc., off from things that have got a lot of legal, political, tax-based, state, etc., behind them. The trouble with being a libertarian, though I'm skeptical about it as a movement, a lot of my instincts are very much like theirs. The trouble about being that is, of course, you're just done in by the old Irish joke, where the chap says to some passerby, "And how would I get to Dublin from here?" Man looks at him very worriedly and says, "Well, if I was going to Dublin, I wouldn't start from here." And of course, that's the trouble. If you're a libertarian, what you really want is to start from the state of nature. And I have bad news, which is that the 21st century United States is not much like a Lockean state of nature, which was inland America before it had been much colonized. So it is very hard to know what you'd actually want to put in place. And of course, what you get are these sort of very shifty tactical alliances. But I don't think a libertarian really is in business of supporting Aetna and, whatever it is, United Healthcare. Because I think a libertarian thinks that they wouldn't exist in a libertarian world, and that they only exist because there are government subsidies all over the landscape that enable people to put together these sort of quasi-monopolies. But then you say, well, you're here. How do you break them up without causing catastrophes? And that's what I think people like Rand Paul just have too much trouble with. It's a variation on the same problem that sort of enthusiastic evangelicals like Rick Santorum face in the other direction, which is that, given you've got a country which is in a loose sense religious, but is infinitely far from coalescing on one particular vision of what that entails, the notion that you can somehow, as it were, stamp your feet and get cultural unity is just highly unplausible. So I think if I was offered the job by Rand Paul, I'd say, thank you very much. I have a friend over Have you met my friend Tomasi? Why don't you go call him up? Nobody I know who's ever worked for a politician has ever liked it. I've known a lot of people who've done it. Bob Westbrook, who wrote a wonderful book on Dewey, went off to work for Bill Bradley and lasted 4 weeks. And chronically, people like John Gray, who are Flavour of the Month with Tony Blair for 6 weeks, that was it. And they all feel betrayed. Because the politician says, I have to do that because this is politics. Academic advisor says, but you don't believe it. Academic advisor is politely shown the door.
One more question, please.
Intellectually, I agree that libertarians tend to ground a lot of their thought on on property rights. However, in my experience, speaking with libertarians and myself being a former libertarian, I'll emphasize that part, that the real thing isn't really property, but the desire for cooperation. When you have government involved, it creates complacency. It's no longer your responsibility. And studies have shown that the reason people who are more quote-unquote liberally minded don't get as involved in several good works or give to charity because they think you need government to be more systematically involved. Conservatives tend to be more individually involved because they think it's their responsibility. And to me, libertarianism wants to encourage cooperation among people, because once government is involved, it becomes coercive and people no longer want to get involved. So wouldn't you think that's actually a better argument for libertarianism and actually a better grounding for it?
There's a sort of sense in which, if you want to play the game of going down the track from John Stuart Mill into libertarianism, then one would take your view. And the reason why is because then one would, so to speak, say that property rights are as flexible as you like. What we're after is maximizing the scope for individuals to cooperate with each other, to produce freely, to pushing government a long way out of it, downplaying all the sort of Marxian worries about the irrationality of the marketplace, pushing up the idea of individuals coalescing to cooperate for particular purposes they subscribe to. And that, that's a picture of the world I have nothing much to object to. It's simply that in terms of, as it were, what is actually, put out as being, or agreed by people who write reviews in the Wall Street Journal as being, the libertarian doctrine, really is these days the sort of pure milk, Rothbardian, Nozikian property rights kind of picture. And there is, of course, always going to be a puzzle, which is on what terms you think people will happily cooperate. And the more you play up the notion that cooperation runs through, I will do this for you if you do this for me, and less on let's both do what not together, then the story about cooperation tends to look less persuasive. But no, I've got nothing against that as a way of talking about it. Of course, libertarian anarchists are on the whole people I'm rather fond of. And the whole sort of Paul Goodman kind of line. But of course that tends to be people who don't really much mind about property rights at all, but do mind very, very much indeed about individual liberty. And of course the more libertarian those communes tended to be, the less long they lasted. You get all kinds of dilemmas that wet liberals like myself don't really much like contemplating. But no, the argument that there could be cooperation is a perfectly good argument. I just don't think it's the one that the Cato Institute at the moment is particularly trying to sell to people.